activity requires a different setting on everything.
Mm-hmm.
And I have no motor skills. I have absolutely none of the tech stuff. I have people who do that.
But you have great hair.
I have great hair. What can I say? There it is. And I keep foofing it like it's going to somehow get better. But there it is. This is my life. This is my light. Where are you?
Believe it or not, I'm in South Florida.
I would absolutely think so.
I lived in LA twice in the 80s, and then again I left because of not being able to get where I wanted to go and do what I wanted to do, and then I loved the business so much that I went back again in the early 2000s, and I just wasn't dysfunctional enough to make it.
So where did you repair to? Are you like Boca? Or are you Miami?
Just north. I'm in the Palm Beach area.
In the Palm Beach, Wellington?
No, pretty close to the ocean. I'm in the Palm Beach Gardens, Jupiter. It's an oasis up here. It's really spectacular.
Oh, I remember Jupiter because that was Burt Reynolds' territory.
That's right.
And I was working with him, and he had a theater, and he was running a school.
That's right.
And I was doing some television. He did television there. He shot Dan August there. But we were doing, what were we doing? We were doing, I forget, something I had to go down there and my friend Soccer Channing was doing a play at the theater at the time.
Wow.
True for the Seesaw, I think. Yeah. Charles Dawson Riley directed it. It was a bizarre cast.
Oh my God, how terrific is that?
People and it was like it was a dinner theater, and they would munch their way through the show. It was a two-character play, so it was really hilarious.
Well, food comes first around here, so
yeah. And he was like Jupiter born. His father was the police chief of Palm Beach County, and he was the football hero. I mean,
Florida State or something like that. He went to Florida State and.
I knew his story pretty well back then. So you were managing people when you were out here?
I was in the 80s. I was a personal appearance agent.
Oh.
And, I just was at the Improv every night. A friend of mine from back east picked me up in the car and said, here, this is where you're going to go. This is where you're going to live every night now for the rest of your life. And, pushed me into the door, and it was like, go ask for Bruce Smirnoff and go ask for Mark Goldstein and go ask for this one and that one. And I did. They kind of took me in to embrace me and just started hanging around there every night. Who wouldn't? I mean, the people that were there every night, Jerry Seinfeld, Paul Reiser, I could just go on and on and on, the people that were there. And were you
there in the early 80s?
Yes, I got there in 81. And
so were you there when we did Mud Will Be Flung Tonight, the Bette Midler comedy album?
No.
I think that was probably was around 83.
Oh, I was there in 83. I just wasn't there like in 88 or 89.
Well, we were there. We kind of commandeered the place for a few nights. Bud was her original manager.
That's right. Back in New York City on 44th Street.
That's right.
Wow. Yeah. So if you don't mind, I mean, I have a whole lot of respect for you.
Yes, go on. You were talking about me?
So for someone who wasn't super in your part of the world, I certainly heard a lot about you and had a lot of respect for you.
Oh.
So anybody that's, funny and can be funny like on demand, boy, I have a whole lot of respect for you. So
me too.
Yeah, I don't blame you. So this show is about talking about the golden age of comedy. For the most part, because I've been doing about 20 shows now, I would get the stand-up comedians on here, and we would just talk about those days back in the Improv. And right. I don't expect that from you, but I see you have a Key West mug.
I do. I do, because I love Key West, and for the last, I guess, 6 or 7 years, I've been going down there in June, which is like out of season, because that's when they do Pride, and I'm a gay icon. So we do. There's Stoli sponsors this huge Bartender of the Year competition where they fly bartenders in from all over the country, and the finals are on Key West, and it's a week-long orgy, and I do mean orgy, of judging, and I'm one of the judges, and then it ends with where we crown the winner, and then the next day is Pride, and the conch train shuts down, and there's a parade down Duval Street. I mean, it's like a mini version of a Pride, but it's pretty fabulous because it's June, so like the high end, the snowbirds are not there, so it's really people who live in the Keys, and a lot of them are military, and a lot of them are people who drove as far as they could from wherever they lived, and this was the last place they got because they couldn't drive any further.
Can't go any further than the Keys.
So there's that makes for a really weird complexion of people who were on the run from something and have settled down. And of course, it's the tropics, and so everything is kind of slightly sleazy, and nobody ever has to really dress. In this pandemic, we joke about how I haven't worn pants since March 12th. Well, Key West, nobody has. I mean,
So I'm going to.
So anyway, so I love Key West, but again, this was I have a tower of mugs because I'm heavily caffeinated.
That is a real beauty, though. I have to.
It really is kind of. It's all that I don't see any drag queens on it. I mean, I see all the square things that people like, the palm trees, dolphins, sailing, all the Jimmy Buffett kind of shit.
So I want to officially invite you, Bruce Vilanch, to the 80's golden age of comedy show. Thank you. I love that. I love that.
Back to the 80's, yeah.
So you are by far the most colorful person I've had on the show.
Oh my God! So I can immediately think of who you haven't had on. If that's the case.
A lot of straight comics who just happen to be very funny.
Of course, they're allowed to be.
But you have quite an unbelievable background, incredible accomplishments that very few comics, maybe Billy Crystal has, can hold a little bit
of.
Well,
he's pretty amazing. That's because I'm not really a comic. I mean, and that was never a career goal. I wanted to be an actor. I wanted to be on Broadway. I wanted to be Zero Mostel. And I wound up writing because I was never getting cast because I was too young for everything I was right for. And I was fat and I had a deep voice. But there were like genuine adults who had that. And I was a child actor, more or less. So I started writing, and I wound up writing for a lot of other funny people. And then what happened actually was, this is so sick, but AIDS kickstarted my comedy career because when people died, their families tended to descend and take the body away and bury them somewhere, in some unknown land because they were so ashamed. And so the people who they'd left behind would want to have some kind of a memorial, but we didn't want them to be memorials because it would be an endless stream of tears. So we called them celebrations, and I wound up emceeing these things. And it was fun. I mean, and we honored these people in the way they should be. And it kind of morphed into going into a club, not a comedy club, but going into like a cabaret and telling stories and singing silly songs and that kind of stuff and doing the news of the day. And that it just kind of evolved. And so suddenly I found I was doing personal appearances. And then when I did Hollywood Squares, after 20 years of the other stuff, when I did Hollywood Squares, suddenly I was famous. I was on television every night. And when you're on television every night, you get all kinds of weird bookings. You get all kinds of strange offers. And so I started doing that thing for real. And then I did Hairspray for 2 years. So I was suddenly legit. And it just kind of grew from there. But I never played the clubs. I mean, I did one little. I would play a club like the Improv on gay night. Often I would MC gay night because I would be the biggest name there, and I would bring up a lot of these comics who were gay and who wanted to perform for a change. They wanted to perform to a sympathetic crowd, not a crowd that was going to be hostile from the get-go. Okay, prove it to me, cocksucker. You know, so I did a lot of that. But other than that, I would never actually book myself in there because I would have to bring in my own crowd. And there's a crowd that goes to comedy club. They don't know who's there. They just want to go to the comedy club. In my experience, they are the squarest audiences. And you have to do material. Hey, my Asian girlfriend, and how about the Windows 2.0, and that kind of shit. So that's not what I do. So I never did it. However, I changed agencies at one point, and the new agent said, you got a great booking, the Dallas Improv and the Houston Improv. And I thought, I don't want to do a comedy. Oh no, it's great. It's different. You will bring in your crowd, and you're going to headline. That's what I mean, headline. They said, well, there'll be 3 other comics on the bill, and there'll be the host. And I said, what? I don't want to do that. And but I didn't want to piss them off because I had just signed with the office. So I went and I did it, and it was okay. I mean, I did bring in my people, and Houston, the Houston and Dallas people who go to the Improv are a little bit hipper than what I would view as a Texas crowd. These are not people who voted for Satan for senator, and it was okay. But I said, I never want to do that again. I never want to have to follow 3 people who are local and who have fans. I'm not competitive. That's not me. I think in order to survive in that world that you were such a strong part of, you have to really have that cutthroat need to be a star. And a lot of that was fostered by what happened during the 80s, where stand-up comics became mega billionaires because they sold their acts to television and became sitcom stars.
Right.
And Ray Romano and Jerry Seinfeld and Roseanne Barr and I don't know, Kevin James and you name it, a whole bunch of them, Ellen, all became television stars because they took their act and they turned it into a TV series about themselves, about their character. Had I known I could do that, I might have done it, but I didn't know. I didn't think and I still don't think I could have done it at the time. And I didn't have that thing that said, you must do this, that type A personality thing.
Yeah. It's all encompassing and it's all.
But I worked behind the scenes with a lot of people like that, which was fun. I liked that. Hollywood was full of people who were fabulous and who, like Kay Thompson, who was behind Judy and Liza, and Roger Eaton's. I mean, Judy created a whole team of people who became big musical comedy people. But I thought, okay, I like doing that. That's
Show your T-shirt. Show your T-shirt.
I'm showing my T-shirt. This is, speaking of sidekicks, this is Gladys Kravitz. This is Alice Pierce, who was a fabulous character actress who is most famous for being on Bewitched as the neighbor, the next door neighbor. This is Gladys looking out her window at something that Samantha the witch is doing.
Right.
With suitable horror. Those character actresses, I would have done that. I would have been the gay neighbor in a second. I mean, I would have been Paul Lynde if they'd let me. Instead, I wrote Paul Lynde because there was a Paul Lynde. There didn't need to be another one until he died, and then Hollywood Squares came back and they said, "You could be Paul Lynde on this one."
Do you think people outside his immediate circle knew he was gay, or was he? I know everybody loved him.
I think everybody. I think they all. It's like we used to. When we were in writers' rooms on comedy shows, I think this still happens, although there's much more latitude now. We would do something, we'd come up with a situation or a joke, and somebody would say, "Oh, a lot of people are going to be offended by that." And the truth of it is, there would be people who would get it, would love it, and everybody else who would go right over their heads. So that was what it was like with Paul. People who knew there were homosexuals in the world knew he obviously was one of them, and it didn't bother them.
Right.
And
Right.
people for whom that was like a whole alien they just thought he was the funny uncle at Thanksgiving. Everybody has a funny uncle. Now they realize it's a funny gunkle. You know, it's and unless, I mean, you know, you have to be really mondo swishy like Leslie Jordan. I mean, who created the whole fabulous fairy character. You know, Paul was like very waspy, and he was always the villain. He was always the used car salesman who was putting it over on you, or the tax auditor who wouldn't let you get away with it, or it was always some obstacle to the hero getting something done. So everybody on the show, everybody around knew, of course, but when I toured with him, we put a show together during the Hollywood Squares hiatus, and it was like the Paul Lynde Review, and you had Mimi Hines and Roz Kelly, who was Pinky Tuscadero on Happy Days, and a bunch of acts, and he would come out in a caftan with a cigarette and take questions from the audience at one point. And inevitably, a woman would say, "Are you married?" And the whole audience would just kind of laugh at that. And then it would get very quiet. And then he would look at her with this kind of like, you know, laser glare of his and say, "Lady, do you live in a cave?" So yeah, everybody knew, but it was the thing that, you know, nobody talked about. I'm fond of quoting Mike Nichols, who made The Birdcage, and
Oh, beautiful.
at the time he said, "Well, you know, things are changing. Homosexuality, love is the love that dare not speak its name, and now it's the love that won't shut up."
Hey, was he happy in love? Did he have, you know, one person in his life, or because I know comedians have a really tough time.
He had on and off. He always had relationships, but they didn't last, and they were pretty volatile. And one of them famously ended in the guy falling out of the hotel room window and to his death.
Oh.
This was in the 50s. So he didn't have a great history of relationships. And even if he was in one, he was on the prowl. You know, the thing about Paul is that on one drink he was hysterically funny, and on two drinks he became the Nazi high command. He was just horrible. So you tried to keep him to one drink, but professionally that was easy, but on a personal level it was much more difficult.
I hope you forgive me for asking, because every once in a while I have someone on the show who's had an intimate professional relationship working with someone. One time it was Rodney Dangerfield, and you know, another time was this one and that one. And I don't know anything about these people, so I apologize if I asked questions, but I've always admired him from a distance, but knew absolutely nothing about him.
Rodney was he was a fabulous character. It's an interesting study because fame came to him late in life.
Yes.
I mean, he was already in his 50s when suddenly he exploded. So he had been in the trenches, you know, driving from Grossingers to the Concorde for many, and then down to the Deauville for many years. And so it hit him, and it allowed him, when he got famous and suddenly he was rich, it allowed him to indulge his wildest side, and he had a very wild side. And so there were a lot of drugs, there was a lot of drinking, and eventually he got completely insane, in the sense that he didn't care anymore. You know, I remember having a meeting with him, and we were waiting, and this Cadillac pulled up into the parking lot, and a guy stepped out of it in a bathrobe and flip-flops, and it was Rodney. And he came up to the meeting. He was at the executive offices at CBS, you know, and sat there with the bathrobe open, the schwann's hanging down, and under the table, which of course I had to take a peek. And I mean, it was, you know, part of you thought it was an Andy Kaufman performance art piece, because Andy used to do weird things like that too. And
Right.
part of me thought, no, this is just a crazy old guy who's done a lot of coke, and doesn't care anymore. And that was really the case. That being said, he was an incredibly generous individual. I mean, gave a million people breaks, floated a lot of people through bad times. Was the first to really run a club that was an above board comedy club, Dangerfield's, that was not like an in joint that was marketed to the masses. Uh, and when he got in movies, he was a real pro. It wasn't like he got into the movies and suddenly you had to rebuild the schedule around. He was there. He showed up. He brought it. And even towards the end when he was making, I don't know what the last couple of pictures were that weren't brilliant, but he was just really and that there was that whole top-notch kind of thing about it. So he was a fascinating guy. He was a lot of fun to be around, and I had fun. I didn't write that much for him. I did some television stuff for him, and he was involved in specials and things. And occasionally, I would see him. I'd run into him, and I would think of something because the thing about Rodney is it wasn't even the jokes. It was Rodney who was so funny.
Yeah.
I mean, Rodney would come out on stage and he would say, I'm okay now, but earlier today I was in bad shape. And he's twitching and pulling his tie, and that alone was hysterical because obviously he was not in good shape right then. And he would do a joke, and he would say, he wouldn't even do a joke. He would say, "My wife is so fat. Boy, is she fat." That scream. They would scream just on that, because they knew something was coming. But his attitude was so hysterical. It was kind of like B. Arthur on Golden Girls. Somebody would say something, and she didn't have to say a word. They would go to her, and she would just kind of go, "Bring the house down," because you knew she was reloading.
Right. Wow.
I mean, those kinds of people they're diamonds. It's to have that kind of power, to just be able to get up there and not even have material, but just be a genuinely funny character. That's what he was. He was one of them.
I think that started with Jack Benny.
Well, yeah, sure. He had a character, and the slow take. I mean, he perfected the slow take. I mean, even when you couldn't see the slow take on radio, you could picture the slow burn that he was doing, or whatever the joke. He had the greatest audio jokes, or and just. I remember there was one. He said this was a radio joke. He said, "Oh, Rochester, go upstairs and get me my Bell and Howell electric blanket." And Rochester Eddie Anderson said, "Mr. Benny, we ain't got no Bell and Howell electric blanket. We do now." That was the joke, because the moment he mentioned Bell and Howell, he knew they would send him an electric blanket.
That was the sponsor.
Anyway, I didn't do it well, but it was. I'm afraid it's so touchy to do an Eddie Rochester Anderson.
Yes, the comedian.
That was what was so funny about it. I mean, he also was hysterical. He was just. I mean, he was a character. He was a type, but he had great timing. He nailed it every time.
Yeah.
But now it's like. Everybody's so fucking sensitive.
Yeah, the comedians are saying that they couldn't do a Jack Benny show now. I just said they couldn't do it.
Well, but Rochester would be difficult. Yeah, sure. People being ethnic, like Jackie Mason being a Jew. It's I mean, it's people being ethnic. But
I got to know Jackie back at the Improv in the 80s. That was really fun. He was spending some time there.
Well, he was hilarious. He was a very funny person. His befuddlement, I mean, just talking about real estate, Beverly Hills adjacent. It's not in Beverly Hills. It's next to Beverly Hills. It's across the street from Beverly Hills. You go down the corner. There's Beverly Hills. Over here is there, but here is adjacent. This is adjacent. That's Beverly Hills. Oh, here's adjacent. That's hysterical. It was hysterical, and it's just him, like a combination of outrage and befuddlement.
Absolutely. That's perfect. That's perfect. You know, you did mention Andy, and I'm still looking for
Uh,
someone who actually worked with him because he's such an enigma. I mean, people to
well,
this
called
day.
called Bob Zamuda. Bob Zamuda was who founded Comic Relief, was Andy's manager, and was his ally, and in on it from the very beginning. He's the guy to talk to. And we used to get mistaken for each other when I had a beard. I think we both had beards and curly hair at one point. And I would get people like at comedy clubs running up to me and saying, can you get me Andy for? Not, not him.
Did you ever work with Andy at all?
Yes, but he was in his own compartment, and I knew him. He was a big Bette Midler fan, and he would come see all of her shows. So we would hang out afterwards. But I don't think I ever actually wrote. He came self-contained
Sure.
all the time,
Oh
and
yeah.
a lot of his stuff. I mean, like a lot of performance artists, as George Slaughter would say, he never hit funny. It was always you were sitting back and admiring the conception, which was the app with George, of course, who came up with Laugh-In. This was exactly the opposite of what he was into.
Right.
So he would kind of say, "It's not for me, but I see how people, are getting it." He said, "It's just not my kind of stuff." So Andy always had that going for him, that he was like the anti-comedian.
So I also want to know about you from the early days. You know, I love for the people watching to know where did Bruce grow up? How did Bruce grow up? What was his family life like? And I can prove that most of the time that anybody goes into comedy does that, for
Well, yeah.
defensive reasons.
Well, I was born in New York. I was adopted when I was 4 days old by a lovely couple from Paterson, New Jersey, who took me across the George Washington Bridge to Jersey at 4 days, the first of many insults I discovered. I joke about that, but not really. I mean, I grew up in Paterson, and my father was a doctor, and my mother was kind of a showgirl, but she married my father pretty young, and so she never really got to realize her ambitions. But she wasn't like Gypsy Rose Lee's mother. She wasn't crazy, but when it became clear that I was happy performing, I would make faces in the mirror. I would dance around for the family. I don't have any video. Billy Crystal has video of him as a kid performing at family functions because they couldn't quite believe it themselves. They were just like my parents, but they never. We didn't have a camcorder. We didn't have we didn't have those kind of skills. But so I grew up in that. But they enabled me a lot, and they encouraged me to perform. They were afraid I would perform as a career, and they thought there was more money in writing. And they kept saying, "Go write for newspapers; they'll never die."
Ah!
Who knew? But my mother's side of the family was very funny. And actually, she had an uncle. Her uncle Mickey was a Catskills comic. Mickey Landau. He was never a big deal. He really was one of those comics who drove from the Nevele to Kutcher's to, and he would do 3 gigs a night, and then drive back home to Brooklyn at 4 o'clock in the morning. But everybody in her family was hilarious. They didn't know it. I mean, but they were really funny, and I was at their feet studying. So I think I picked up a lot of their timing, and I still do stuff. I still say things that they would say. I could hear them saying them, and I'm repeating them. So and my parents were so enabling that they didn't want to send me to a professional school like Fame. They did. I wanted to go to the high school of performing arts. They didn't want me to do that. They thought that was like making too much of a commitment. They wanted me to have a real life. But I did go to a camp. I went to summer camp, and I went to a camp that was run by Ted Mack.
Oh wow.
Ted Mack was like Simon Cowell. He was like the Gong Show. He was, it was the original Amateur Hour, and it was a huge television show when I was a kid. And he's famous for rejecting Elvis because Elvis was a little too dirty for his demographic. And I used to joke with Anne Margaret, who I worked with for years and years on her big Vegas stage act. because she was on the show and she lost to a woman who played Lady of Spain on The Leaf.
Oh, oh my God.
Like it was a harmonica, and she came in second. But undaunted, she went back to she was in an act at the time, and George Burns saw them, or Jack Benny saw her, one of the two of them, and put them on the bill with. Anyway, so we used to, and Ted ran a camp in the Berkshires, and it was a professional performing camp, and we did shows every summer, and it was very high level. There were a lot of kids of famous people who were there. One of them was Sue Lesser, whose father was Frank Lesser, who wrote Guys and Dolls and How to Succeed in Business and a lot of Oscar-winning songs. And he came up, he was writing a show. He wrote a show up there called Green Willow, which was a musical for Tony Perkins, which flopped actually, but some great songs came out of it. Anyway, he was there in residence it was that kind of a thing. So I was steeped in big time showbiz, and I never let go of that. I just said, well, this is what I really want to do, and I'll play along and go to college, and I'll be writing. I write on the paper, and so I'll have like two careers. I'd had two majors in college. I had a theater and journalism.
So tell me about that next step. How you
got? I was at the Ohio State University, and I got a job on the Chicago Tribune because I went to Chicago and kind of fell in love with it, and they offered me a great job as a feature writer, and I was there, and I was like Rex Reed. I was interviewing everybody who came through town to promote their movie and whatnot, and I was writing weird, kind of light features about what was happening around town, and I met Bette Midler. Bette was on Broadway in Fiddler, and she used to sing at the Improv, and Bud Friedman had signed her, and he got her a booking at a famous club in Chicago called Mr. Kelly's, where she opened for a very popular comic named Jackie Vernon.
Oh, wow.
He was the deadpan comic, When I was a kid, I was unwanted. Now I am wanted in 13 states. And so she opened for him, and I went to, and Bud called me and said, if you like her, would you write about her? And I wrote about her because she was brilliant. And she called me and said, you're a very funny writer. That was a funny column. And I said, well, you're funny. You should talk more on stage. And she said, you got any lines? And that was the beginning. And that was only 50 years ago.
Wow.
Oh, where is the digitalis? Please come. Nurse.
Wow.
Anyway, so I started writing for her and going on the road. And then I began writing for a lot of other people who came through town, collaborating with them, with George Carlin and Richard Pryor and Joan Rivers, David Steinberg, not the manager, but the comedian.
Wow.
I was just writing for a lot of people who were in Bette's original group burst out and became their own. Barry Manilow was her piano player.
Right.
Melissa
the original
Manchester.
Improv group out of the New York City.
Yes. Melissa Manchester was a first harlot. Luther Vandross was a backup singer who never actually went on stage because he weighed about 400 pounds at the time.
Wow.
It was everybody. I mean, Michael Bennett did some of the early staging of the stuff. And then Andre DeShields did other staging of it. And the first costumes came from Norma Kamali, who was the wardrobe mistress, I think, on Fiddler. I mean, Bette had there was a whole pool of people who came up with her. She was the leader. So after 5 years of being in Chicago, the Tribune said, what are you going to do? You're on the road all the time and you need to be here. And at that point, Bette's dresser had a brother who had started an act called the Manhattan Transfer. And we put a show together, and they got an album deal, and they got a TV deal to be the summer replacement for Cher. And I came out here to write that show, and I stayed. Bette said, your bags were packed when I met you.
Yeah. Wow. She's quite a lady. That's really someone to have spent time with.
Yeah, she's astounding. It's astounding. Her husband says she's this incredible dynamo packed into this little tiny person who gets all this stuff done. I mean, she's great. She's a real diva. And, she can break your heart and make you laugh, make you cry with laughter, all within the space of a minute. I mean, she's the real thing. I think that's been demonstrated over 50 years. That's bubbled up.
I didn't know about her and Fiddler. I probably wasn't paying that much attention back then to theater or show business. But some of her other movies, I just loved her in.
Well, that was much like, I mean, Fiddler was the very first thing. She'd done a bunch of off-Broadway stuff, and then she got that, and she was in it for 3 years. And she shared a dressing room with Pia Zadora, who was the youngest daughter, and Adrienne Barbeau. And Bette was actually the oldest daughter. She was Zeitel, who got married on stage every night to Leonard Fry. And she was in it for 3 years, and it was always her intent to go to she wanted to do what Barbra Streisand had done, which was to break out on Broadway, but she had bigger ambitions than that. I mean, Barbara was one of the kind of things. She also had her heart was in rock and roll and Janis Joplin and performance like Tina Turner, and she became an amalgam of all of those things. So her path was different, and she finally broke out in Movies with the Rose, which was years later, after she had established herself as a big live attraction and a big recording star.
Yeah, my one experience with her is not a grand one. We were at the Improv, and I think it was dance night, and there was 100 people around, and in walks this woman with I think sunglasses and a sweatshirt and sweatpants, and she just stood by herself in the corner, and that's Bette. Nobody
What
else
happened?
knew.
What happened? People danced?
Oh yeah, Monday night was dance night at the Improv, when Monday night was notoriously slow.
This was in New York.
No, I'm sorry, out in Melrose.
Oh, really? Wow.
Yeah. And it was notoriously slow, and Bud and Mark came up with the idea that why don't we just have like industry dance night? It was just, hey, it's a no-brainer. And as soon as they started doing that, oh my goodness, the people that came in, including Rodney, Bruce Willis, I mean, I could go on forever and ever, but one night, standing by herself in this sweatshirt, no makeup on, was Bette. Nobody knew who she was, and I said, "Oh, that's Bette Midler."
Doesn't not characteristic of her, but hey, things happen.
Yeah,
Maybe she was scoping the place for the album. I don't know. Depends on what year this was.
Well, it was probably about 83 or 84. And
maybe she's looking the joint over. I don't know.
Yeah, I'm sure she missed, being around the original Improv people. She had gotten so big that she just couldn't walk into the Improv and go up on stage. So this was,
Well, that was never her thing either. When we did the album, it was she was kind of coming out of a depression, and her husband said, "Well, do what you do so great. Do a comedy act. You've never done a comedy act. You've always done your music, and the comedy is in between." And so we put together a comedy act, and Atlantic wanted to record it. And we had a couple of special material songs that Mark Shaman and Jerry Blatt wrote with her, and so those were in the act, so that she could always go into a song, which was, of course, how she'd always structured her stage show. But the idea of just coming out and doing material was a whole other thing. To come out and do an hour of that stuff, that was never how she planned to do it. But it wound up working, and the album was a great success. Mud Will Be Flung Tonight. And then right after that, the Jews took over Disney. Disney voted out a whole bunch of the family had been running Disney, and it was in trouble, and the stockholders negotiated not a sale, but they brought in Michael Eisner, who was the head of Paramount, the head of production at Paramount, and Jeffrey Katzenberg, his lieutenant. They came in and they took over the motion picture division. And the first picture they made was Down and Out in Beverly Hills.
Oh.
And they brought Bette over with them. And that was such a big hit that they gave her a production deal. And she became the queen of Disney, which was ironic when you consider she was the last of the truly trashy women. And she was suddenly the queen, the biggest star at Disney.
Wow.
And this was right before that. This was like, okay, I'll do comedy. So she was in the right mood. So I think when they came to her and they said, we want you to come to Disney, I think she said, boy, I really must be funny if they want me to come to Disney.
Can that be seen, that what you put together with her singing and comedy?
There's, I don't know if the, I don't think we shot it. I could be wrong. If we did, it's never been released as such. There's an album, there's a live comedy album that was nominated for a Grammy, which is called Mud Will Be Flung Tonight. And we did a couple of videos because that was in, the heyday of MTV, and they would show a couple of one or two of these videos. But I don't think we actually went and shot the thing on stage. I could be wrong. There could be an archival tape somewhere, but I've never seen it. But with the internet, all this stuff bubbles like lava.
Sure. I want to go back to one thing that you talked about when you had your new agent and they said, go to Dallas and go to Houston and get up on stage there. It takes people years and years to get, 45 minutes to be able to be like a headliner. So what was that like for you? I mean, how much time did you do, and what was that like for
you? Well, I think I did 45 minutes, I think, or maybe even an hour. But by then I had an hour. I mean, I was doing cabaret stuff. I was doing theaters and colleges and stuff like that. So I had an hour, and I'm not sure if I had to actually cut some because there were, three people each doing like 20 minutes ahead of me. And so that was like they'd already heard an hour and 10 minutes of stuff by the time I got out there. Or maybe they weren't doing that much time. Maybe they were doing 15 minutes. I don't remember. But I remember, there was always a host, and he had to do his stuff, and at the top and in between. So it was just adapting what I had done. But it was very clear that I was not the kind of comic that the other people were. They were club comics, with stuff. And although that's not totally fair, because a lot of strange people come up at clubs and do characters, and so but the majority of them are like that, I find. And then I would come on and I would be doing my stories, about this show I worked on and that thing I worked on, and I would do, a bunch of topical stuff at the front. And so it was a different energy. I called it sit down comedy, as opposed to, I didn't prowl. I didn't include them. Everybody else would talk to the audience. I mean, those guys. That's what I mean. I'm not a club. I don't want to talk to the audience. I mean, occasionally I would do a Q&A when I did my one-man show off Broadway.
Tell me more about that.
It was called Almost Famous, which was before Cameron Crowe borrowed the title, for which he has apologized profusely. And it was two acts at Westbeth, which is a very hip performing arts center on the Lower West Side. The very sort of like the very, very West Village, and a lot of people, strange people came. Eddie Izzard broke in there when he first came to America, and actually I think I followed Eddie. I think I was the next act that came in, but I ran it. I did it for 6 weeks, and it was like doing a Broadway show, and there was a script, because it was like Lily Tomlin, except she does characters, some of which I write, but I didn't do characters, but I had hunks. Everything was interconnected, and there was musical stuff that Mark Shaman and Scott Whitman wrote, and it was wonderful. I mean, it was fabulous 6 weeks. Everybody came, by now these are a lot of my friends who were big stars showed up, so there were lots of sightings in the audience and all that, and it was great. I mean, we had offers to take it uptown to Broadway, but I had a feeling I was on Hollywood Squares at the time, so I couldn't really do that. But I don't know. Some other people have done it, and if you go up there and you don't do well, you don't pack them in. I didn't think I would be an event for me to be on Broadway the way with other people who come up there with one-man shows, and they become events. So we didn't do that, and we didn't film it because my people said, no, then you have to come up with a whole new show once you've committed it to film.
That's true.
That's fine. And also, it was like, it wasn't the offers to do that were okay, but they wouldn't. I don't know, they weren't setting like people said, go into the T-shirt business. I said, oh, you go into the T-shirt business. It costs a fortune to set it up, and you're not going to make it back unless you're John Bon Jovi.
Right.
They ain't going to go buy a T-shirt because I said I wore it. It's like there's a certain level of fame that you
have to achieve.
You have to be. I mean, listen, even Bette discovered that when she did her residency at Caesar's Palace 10 years ago. And part of the deal there is they give you a shop because Celine had a shop and Elton had a shop. And people would come out of their concerts and buy all of their swag. So, but Celine was done. And so Elton was still performing there, so his shop was open. But they turned Celine's shop into the Bette Midler Cher shop.
Wow. So
that when Cher was there, it was all her stuff, and when Bette was there, it was all her stuff, with a little corner for the other girl. And Bette's crowd. I mean, she said this was my first foray into retail, and they weren't the kind of crowd that was gonna buy Metallica T-shirt. I mean, they was gonna buy her T-shirts. What are you gonna do? It's just the way it is. Just the way they did not have that kind of identification with her. Some did. I mean, she didn't go broke doing it, but it never achieved what she wanted to. And when a big star like that can't cross that threshold, it really does. You have to have a certain kind of fan. Teenage girls are really.
That helps.
That J-Lo, Gaga, Katy Perry, anybody who does an inauguration. Those people. Those are the people who make a lot of money on merch. And country bands, because they buy T-shirts for formal wear. So.
Yeah, I'm a T-shirt collector, so I know what you're saying. So you have mentioned some really wonderful people that you enjoyed working with. Other than the people you've mentioned, who have you really had a good time with when you worked with them?
Whoopi, who hasn't really come up yet. Billy, Robin. He was wonderful. He was fat. He was wonderful, and I would write stuff, and I used to joke I'd throw it in the cage, and then he would elaborate and embroider and take it on stage and do it. And he was the greatest guy. And he was like Rickles. The two of them they had personas, and then they had who they were. And sometimes they would overlap, but often if you were with them and somebody else came along, they would go into the persona. They weren't always that character. And there aren't many people. Mae West was always that character. She was kind of fun to hang around, but she was always sort of being Mae West. I mean, she wouldn't be funny necessarily, but she would be talking business. But in that same, I'd like 15% of the popcorn. Oh, it was that was her, and that was why it's always. I would always say I don't know how to write Mae West as a character because nobody would believe it. Because I mean, nobody thinks that people, are when they're at home that they're like that. You think Lucille Ball is Lucy Ricardo when she's at home? No, and that's what Lucy Arnaz keeps telling people.
I just happened to have watched their home video movie just the other night that her daughter put together. It was very interesting. I think it was.
Oh yeah. Well, Lucy's involved in this in the movie that Aaron Sorkin wrote about her parents. That Kate Blanchett was going to do it. Now it's Nicole Kidman's going to do it with. As she's very fond of saying, this is about Lucy and Desi, not about Lucy and Ricky.
So, did you make it like without an agent, just because of your creativity and your fun? And
I when I was back in Chicago, and people kept saying, "Come to Hollywood, come to Hollywood," or I could have gone to New York because I had talked to Lorne Michaels about writing on this new show he was doing called Saturday Night Live.
Yeah.
And I knew him because he worked on Lily Tomlin's shows. but I didn't want to do that. I didn't want to live in New York, and I didn't. And I guess I wanted to go to Hollywood, but so I promised myself. I said I won't go out there until I have an agent and a job. And it's 50 years later and 45 years later, and I still recommend that to people. Don't come out here unless you have an agent or a job.
Right.
I had an agent. I had a girl I went to college with who became we were briefly in a romance, and she left me for the campus radical, and I left her for the football team. And she became my agent. She was an agent at William Morris, and later my manager. And so I had her and her agents out here, and I came out with a Manhattan transfer. I had a job, so at least I had a job. I had something I could say, hey, I worked, because that's very important. I tell people that the same thing, although now I would have to say I would think it's much easier to acquire those things because of the internet, because you can display yourself on the internet and showcase yourself on YouTube, and become rich like Randy Rainbow. I mean, it's now not there never was a place. There was nothing like that. You had to come out here and actually pay your dues.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
I mean, you had to work hard scrabble, and a lot. I think it's been made much easier. At the same time, I also think that a lot of people who really should quit are constantly encouraged. I don't know who said it first, but I quote Pauline Kael, and she said, "Hollywood is where you can get encouraged to death," because a lot of people who are rejected by all the regular mainstream people are convinced that they've got it and don't let go. And the internet enables them. And they can put themselves on the internet and they have no idea how nowhere they are. But they're on the internet along with all these other people who got discovered off the internet. So it's around the corner. It's going to happen. And then they're 50 years old and they're looking around saying, why am I a barista at Starbucks? I mean, it's not going to happen. Figure it out.
Yeah, I left twice. Like I said earlier, I believe I left twice. I love the industry. I love almost everything about it. But I had to leave because it just wasn't. I wasn't finding my place in it, and it was tough to leave. So this is
but you made the smart decision. A lot of people I know just hang on, and you don't want to piss on anybody's dream. But the fact is, a lot of us live in denial. We pretend that we are living what we want, that we're not doing what we really want to do. And if you're 50 years old and you're trying to be a comic and you're working as a barista at Starbucks, you're enjoying this. I mean, if you wanted it, it would have happened if it could happen. It hasn't happened. So you have to find something that will happen for you, because otherwise you really are going down the road to misery and defeat. But it's very difficult to tell people that, because people, I mean, when you got this dream, I've been lucky and it was realized, but for a lot of people, it's harder. And first you have to get over yourself.
Yeah. So I want to finish with you writing for some of the most incredible shows, the most watched shows in television ever, other than a Super Bowl. Tell me how you got
number two after the Super Bowl, the Academy Awards.
Tell me how that all came about.
Well, I've been writing for various people when they presented on the Oscars over the years, and finally in 1989. A guy named Alan Carr.
Oh my God, I know Alan.
Was hired to produce the Oscar show, and he brought me in to write it. And because we'd known each other, I met him with Anne Margaret on a press junket when they came to Chicago to promote a really bad movie called Cece and Company, with Joe Namath as her leading man.
Oh my God!
And it was about bikers. And anyway, we all became very, very, very close after that. And so Alan, some years later, I mean, already 20 years later, asked me to write the thing. And so I came in and did it, and it was a notorious Snow White Rob Lowe show, and it kind of killed Alan. I mean, he never recovered from it. But a small band of us went on. The next year, Billy Crystal came on. A new producer, Gil Cates, came on, and he produced 17 of them. And Billy was the host, and I was there. I survived, and because I worked with Billy on other shows. And I did 23 of them formally, and some of them as writer, some of them as writer, and then informally over the last few years I've been contributing, because people know that I know the show and they don't like what they get. See, what happens a lot of times is the show's hosted by television stars who have a show on the air, and they have a dozen writers on staff, and they bring them all over. There's no money left in the budget. So they hire maybe one person at a discount to write the rest of the show. And so a lot of times these people who are used to writing for this star personality don't really know how to write for Keanu Reeves and Miley Cyrus to present the sound editing awards. And I mean, some of them do because they're talented writers, but sometimes they don't. And sometimes those people call me up and ask me to do some work on it. So it's great fun. It's kind of like, I'm glad you brought up the Super Bowl, because that's what it's like. If I were a football player, I'd want to play in the Super Bowl. And so for the kind of thing I do, it is the Super Bowl, and it's live and it's around the world, and it will resonate. What people say will be quoted for years afterwards. Just ask Sally Field, who finally monetized her Oscar speech in a Visa commercial. But it's the most fun you can have doing this kind of stuff.
Hey, do you think, what percentage of those acceptance speeches, and of course, every time a major award is given and there's 6 people that could get it and only one wins, of course, how much of that speech is written by people like you?
Well, it depends on who it is. I mean, most of them are written by themselves, or sometimes they call and they, it takes a kind of, I don't know what the word is, not hubris, but something like that, to call and say, I need you to help me on a speech in case I win.
Right.
I mean, unless you know somebody, which is been the case with me with acceptance speeches. Most of the time, it's they come up with it themselves. But I mean, that's not our job as writers on the show. We don't write acceptance. So, but if it's somebody who I know and they call and I, sometimes if they can remember it when they get up there, because they tend to be gobsmacked in the moment, they'll do a joke, and sometimes it'll be the joke that you gave them. But of course, I can't tell you who I did that for, because it would be a betrayal.
So you've won some. So you've won some awards.
I've won 6 Emmys, and 2 of them I got to accept, and one of them I actually got to speak, because it was there. Those two were for Oscar shows that were hosted by Billy, and the first one, he was a writer on the show, obviously, and it was in Hawaii. He was on vacation, and he didn't want to come back because he didn't think he was going to win. And I don't know if he was nominated for hosting it, or I don't know. I think he thought somebody else, I forget who, was going to win. Anyway, we won the writing award, and so the writers all got to get up, and we all, because nobody in the booth was going to cut off one of the award show writers, because they were all friends and colleagues. We all got to say something.
Right.
So I had one line. I came up and said, I'm only sorry I didn't have to sleep around to win this. And I was the last one to speak, so they went out on that. It was a big laugh, and they went out on it.
Oh, wow.
And the director went over to the PA and said, thanks for that. I thought that was the ultimate pro compliment. It was like they got out on a laugh.
That's beautiful.
But then the other time, the next year, we were nominated again, and Billy was there, and we won. And Billy gave the speech, and we all stood behind him and smiled. And actually, I was writing the show that year. It was the Emmy show goes on a wheel, and each year one of the networks, and that was Fox's year, and their idea was to have 3 comedians. So they had Tim Allen, Dennis Miller, and Kirstie Alley hosting it, and I was one of the writers on it.
Wow.
So I took off my badge, I went out, and I went back on upstairs, put on my badge, and continued working while everybody else was in photographs and stuff like that.
So this picture is from a real outsider asking for everybody who's going to be, not in show business. How long did it take you to write before that show aired?
The Oscars?
Yeah.
Well, of course, this year is unprecedented,
Right.
so it doesn't count. But until recently, until the last few years, nothing could happen basically until the host was hired. And that would usually happen in the fall, and then late summer, early fall. And then around October, we'd sit down and start writing, start conceptualizing things. And they would in October announce the honorary awards. So we could work on the honorary awards, but basically nothing really could be, the bulk of the writing couldn't happen until the nominations would come out. And then it would be 6 weeks of craziness. And that would be from January to the air date, end of February, early March. And that would be because once you knew the movies that you were dealing with, then you could do the material that you could write. And also nobody would commit to being on the show until they knew who was nominated and who wasn't. And the first thing that happened was the honorary awards went away because it added an hour to the show. And they're presented in a separate ceremony, which is the governor's award, which is a separate revenue stream for the Academy. And then they edit the acceptance speeches and show it on the broadcast. So without that having to be written, you don't have to start writing until basically right around the time the nominations come out.
Wow.
And I'll explain why, since we mentioned Andy Kaufman, one of the Billy years was the year of The Man in the Moon with Jim Carrey as Andy. And we thought that was an absolute lock as a nominee. And we were working up material and stuff, and then he wasn't nominated. So we had to throw all that crap out, and not crap, but all that work we had to throw out. And so it's kind of like pointed up, don't count your chickens, wait till the eggs are hatched and then go, okay, now we can do this, we can do that, we can do that.
So my very last question, I promise, but it's a two-parter. What do you say is like the most apex time in your career? And then the second part, is there anything you would do differently today than what you did back then?
Well, yeah, I mean, doing Hairspray on Broadway was pretty the height. Hollywood Squares, Hairspray, the Oscars, Bette Midler, they're all kind of orgasmic as far as I'm concerned. And I don't know, I get that question and I think, I don't know what I would have done differently. I mean, I am who I am, and it's worked out okay. And I suppose, if anything, I mean, I would have stuck to my guns and gone to New York and tried to become Zero Mostel, tried to become Nathan Lane. But I didn't do that. And what I did become is okay.
Pretty darn good.
I'm happy, and I've gotten to the point where I don't have to have half a dozen pizzas if something doesn't go right.
Well,
I'm a wise old queen.
Well, I want to thank you very, very much for spending this time with me. Stephen Joyner introduced us, and I really appreciate you being willing to spend this time. It's been a great show. And,
thank you. I actually can plug this. Let's see if this happens. Thanksgiving weekend, I will be in Fort Lauderdale at a club called the Savory, I think it is, or it's a cabaret called the Savory. Let's see. We've postponed it 3 times already.
Will you reserve a couple of tickets for me and my wife? And
oh, of course. Oh my God, he has a wife. I have no luck. No luck. That's why I'm going to Lauderdale, where the boys are.
Oh yeah, oh yeah.
Old Queen waits for me.
Well,
sitting at Rosie's in Wilton Manors.
Well, Wilton Manors.
More South Florida jokes.
Well, listen,
I get enough of them.
You've been great. and I'm
Key
honored.
West, Key West.
It started with Key West. We're ending with Fort Lauderdale.
We're
Perfect.
driving north.
Ah,
That's
Bruce,
it.
God bless you, man. Thank you so
Thank you.
much. And
A
it's
pleasure.
even if I have to wait until Thanksgiving, and even if my wife comes, I really
Oh, bring her along.
us seeing you in person. That would be fantastic. Thank you.
All right. Thank you.
God
Take
bless
care.
everybody. Thanks for watching the 80s golden age of comedy with legends in the world of comedy during the 80s. We'll see you again. Bye bye, everybody. Take care.